Hello, and welcome to Week 9 of Music 103 for the fall of 2020. This week, we're following up on our discussion of triads, getting into some more difficult stuff, specifically triad inversions and diatonic qualities of triads in minor keys. A quick review before we get into new stuff. Remember that triads are chords built specifically as a stack of 2/3. A triad is identified by the root. In other words, a major triad built on E is called an E major triad. The third of a triad determines whether it's major or minor, depending on whether or not it's a major third or minor third above the root. And the fifth of the triad can be lowered to change a minor triad into a diminished triad, or raised to change a major triad into an augmented triad. Two common sets of symbols that tell us things about triads are Roman numerals and chord symbols. Roman numerals help you analyze a triad by indicating what scale degree it's built on in a key, which in turn tells you about its function. Chord symbols give you instructions as to how to build a chord. They don't tell you about what role it plays in a key. So in any diatonic scale, we can build triads on each scale degree. These triads have different qualities depending on what scale degree they're built on. So for example, in a major key, the triads built on scale degrees 1, 4, and 5 will all be major. However, this isn't the case in a minor key. If we compare the diatonic triads of major and natural minor, we see that all the triads in major are the same as those in minor, just rotated to occupy different scale degrees. So for example, a C major triad, which would be Roman numeral 1 in C major, turns into Roman numeral 3 in A minor. Likewise, this F major triad moves from scale degree 4 to scale degree 6, and this G major triad moves from scale degree 5 to scale degree 7, and so on and so forth. This makes sense because we know that natural minor is just a rotation or mode of the major diatonic scale. But what about harmonic minor? How does it affect things to have raised scale degree 7 brought back in? There are some important differences between the diatonic triads in natural minor and those in other forms of the minor scale. Because I don't have a leading tone in natural minor, my scale degree 5 doesn't produce a chord that's really dominant. But when I bring the leading tone back in my harmonic minor scale, I do get that dominant triad with a big capital 5. Likewise, in natural minor, my scale degree 7 doesn't create a diminished triad. That only happens when I bring the leading tone back, raising this G back up to G sharp, for example, to once again create a leading tone on scale degree 7, which changes the quality of my triad back to diminished. Any triad, in any key or mode, can be inverted. In some ways, this is not unlike inverting intervals, which we've talked about previously. Starting from a simple root position triad, we can shuffle the notes so that the third of the triad ends up on the bottom as the lowest note. You can think of doing this by moving the root from the bottom to the top, up an octave. We shuffle again to make the fifth of the triad the lowest note. And if we shuffle one more time, we're back in root position, but up an octave now. So there's 3 possible inversions for triads: root position, first inversion, and second inversion. Maybe the most important thing to remember this week is that what matters in determining an inversion of a triad is what part of the triad is in the bass. It doesn't matter what's above the bass note, how many notes, where they are. What matters is what's in the bass. So take this enormous chord, as long as it has C in the bass, it is still in root position. Say I drop the C from the bottom of this big chord. Now G is my lowest note, and I would be in second inversion, even if everything else about my chord is exactly the same. There's a very old school system for describing the inversions of triads. It's called figured bass notation. I'll try to explain it as simply as possible. For root position, use the numbers 5, 3, or don't write any numbers at all. For first inversion, write the numbers 6, 3 in a little column, or just 6. And for second inversion, write the numbers 6, 4. That's all you really need to know about how to use figured bass to identify inversions of triads. But because I like to explain things unnecessarily, I'll just tell you that the numbers are a shorthand for pitches above the lowest note. 5/3 literally means a fifth and a third above the bass note. 6/3 literally means something a sixth and something a third above the bass note. And of course, 6/4 means something a sixth and a fourth above the bass note. When you use these numbers, you can construct different triads, you guessed it, above a bass note. 5/3, 6/3, 6/4. If you were a working church musician back in 18th century Germany, you probably would be able to read a long string of bass notes with figured bass numbers next to them and improvise the chords that you needed above that line. Most of us don't need to know how to do that today. For the purposes of our class, you really just need to know that figured bass numbers are a shorthand way of describing inversions when we use Roman numeral analysis. When you're writing music using chord symbols, you can describe inversions using what's called slash notation. Basically, whatever is to the right of the slash mark is the lowest note you're going to play. Here's a snippet from Stevie Nicks' Landslide, and as you can see, every other chord is a B-flat/D. That means you should play a B-flat major triad with a D, the third of the chord, in the bass. Because D is in the bass, this would make this first inversion. If we were analyzing these chords with Roman numerals and figured bass numbers, we would give this the figured bass number 6/3. We would know this to be true because we would look at the bass, the lowest note, and see what part of the triad is in the bass. You might be unsure of which notes in this passage count as part of the chord. They're not just written as simple block chords after all. If you look closely at the second and fourth measures, you'll see that every note in those measures is part of the B-flat major triad, either B-flat, D, or F. It's spread out to create an interesting rhythmic pattern. This is called arpeggiation. It's still accurate to analyze the music with these chords, even if it's arpeggiated in this way. For your listening pleasure and education, I've put together a list of songs that all start with melodic first and second inversion triads, and a few that start with minor triads. I'm pretty sure that all of them start with tonic triads, one way or another. If you listen to this list, and I might very well make a little supercut compilation of the beginnings, let me know if you hear any that you think are not tonic triads. So why use inversions at all? Why not just write all of your chords in root position all of the time? The main reason is because different inversions give different emphases to different chords. Generally speaking, if I play a chord in root position with my root in the bass, it's going to sound strong and conclusive. Less so if I play it in first inversion, and even less so than that if I play it in second inversion. Compare these versions. In the first example you see here, both of these chords are in root position, and that means that the bass line has to move down by a whole fourth as it goes on. In the second example, because the second chord is in first inversion, I can have a nice, smooth, stepwise bass line. It gives you a slightly different effect. Inversions of triads tend to make transitions from one chord to another smoother, with more stepwise motion. This idea that we want to move efficiently through a lot of stepwise motion from one triad to another is called voice leading. Related to voice leading is the idea of voicing a triad. Voicing means how you choose to use different parts of your triad and spread it out throughout the range of an instrument or ensemble. How you might choose to voice a triad depends on how you're going to use it. For instance, a triad played on the piano might be configured very differently from a triad played by a string quartet, sung by a choir, or played on synthesizer and bass guitar. If you're a guitarist, you're also concerned with voicings, meaning what's the best way to configure this chord so that it fits on the position I need to play on my guitar, or so that it sounds good in the ensemble I'm playing in. Traditionally, students of music theory are taught to represent triads as a four-voice chord. As you might figure from the name, a four-voice chord includes four notes for four voices: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Those are the standard divisions of a choir: 2 female voices and 2 male voices. You can imagine four-voice chords as a choir, but really they can stand in for any group of instruments where there's a highest voice, 2 middle voices, and a low voice. If you're a guitarist, you're also concerned with voicings, meaning what's the best way to configure this chord so that it fits on the position I need to play on my guitar, or so that it sounds good in the ensemble I'm playing in. There's two typical ways of writing four-voice chords. The one on the left is called choral style, where you see the sopranos and altos in the upper staff and the tenors and basses in the lower staff. The one on the right is called keyboard style. As you might guess, the one on the left is intended for a choir, and the one on the right is intended for a keyboardist to be able to read and play more easily. If you're sharp-eyed, however, you might notice that these are the exact same chords. So for your homework this week, you're going to be identifying four-voice chords and their inversions by both chord symbol and slash notation, and also Roman numerals and figured bass. And I'm going to work through a couple of these real quick right here. For the example on the left, I've given you a chord, and I've told you I want you to label it in a major key of 3 sharps. Remember our class motto, it never hurts to label things. So we begin by labeling all the pitches in this chord. If we pull them over to the side and rearrange them into a stack of thirds, we see that they must be B, D, and F sharp. Let's do the chord symbols first. It must be some kind of B minor chord, and because the lowest note is a D, we write /D. So far, so good. Now you ask yourself, in the key of A major, what scale degree do I build a B minor chord on? It's my second scale degree. Because it's a minor chord, it has to be lowercase. So I write a lowercase 2, and because D, the third of the triad, is the lowest pitch, I know that it's first inversion, and I write the numerals 6-3, which just mean first inversion. The example on the right is a little trickier. I've asked you to do this one in a minor key of 2 flats. I highly recommend having your circle of fifths wheel with you if you haven't memorized your key signatures yet. The relative minor of my major key of 2 flats is G minor, the relative minor of B flat major. Once again, begin by labeling all of your pitches, and then pull them over to the side and make them into a pancake stack snowman pile of thirds. When you do that, you see that this must be D, F sharp, and A. That is a D major triad. So for the chord symbol, all I have to write is a big D. So you ask yourself the question once again, in my key of G minor, what scale degree do I build a D chord on? It's scale degree 5. The thing to pay attention to is that in natural minor, it would be a lowercase scale degree 5, but it's a major triad, so we need to write a capital uppercase 5 to show that it's major. And if we want to be redundant, we can write a little 5-3 to show that it's in root position, but we can actually just not write any figured bass numbers, and that's perfectly fine too for root position. As you do your homework, be sure to look at both staves when you decide the inversion. Remember, once again, whatever is in the bass determines the inversion. I also highly recommend playing these chords on your keyboard. If something sounds funny, then you've probably written something down wrong. And it's just good practice to get in your ear how these chords sound. So that's it for this video. Soon there'll be another video on 7th chords, and that will be even more complicated. If you're getting a little bit overwhelmed, don't worry. We'll be going over triads, inversions, how to write them, and how to analyze them for a lot of the semester here on out. So bear with us, and hopefully I will see you guys soon.